Hi everybody and welcome to another video on Act 3, Scene 3 of Othello. Now this is the fourth video that I'm doing on this scene and I'm only going to do one more after this, I promise. The reason is that it is a very long and complex scene and it seems like it wouldn't quite do the scene justice if I only did one video on this. So I am sorry, but I'm not really particularly sorry either. Okay, so where are we at in terms of the plot? Well, Iago has been weaving his web of deceit around Othello and he has poisoned Othello's mind with the idea that Desdemona might have had an affair with Cassio. And then in this scene, the handkerchief comes in. Now, you might know a little bit about the handkerchief, you might know a lot about it, but I suppose the important thing to say here is that this is a symbol upon which the whole play pivots. And the action of the play becomes so caught up with this tiny little bit of fabric that actually some people haven't quite been able to get their heads around the fact that this is an important object in the play, because it seems so unlikely, doesn't it? So in this scene, Desdemona returns. We know that Othello has started to hate her. He says he's not feeling very well, and she pulls the handkerchief out to give him, to try and kind of bind his forehead with to help him feel a little bit better. And we'll have a look at what happens in a minute too. But before that, let's look at our big question for today's video. And that question is, how does Shakespeare present the patriarchal society in this play? So we're going to be looking particularly at the character of Amelia today. And I absolutely love writing about Amelia, particularly because towards the end of the play she becomes such a powerful character who really symbolises the possibilities for female empowerment. I'll not say too much about that here though. Okay, so at this section, starts kind of middle of Act 3, Scene 3, Desdemona comes back in and is talking to Othello, and she says, "Why do you speak so faintly? Are you not well?" And Othello says, "I have a pain upon my forehead here," so he's got a headache. Desdemona says, "Faith, that's with watching." Now that's interesting. What she means there is that he's not been sleeping. He's been awake all night. Now, this suggests to us that things aren't quite so harmonious in the marriage, that Othello's been lying awake, worrying at night. And this also brings us to what we call the double time of the play. Now, on the one hand, it seems that Desdemona and Othello elope the same night. They set off for Cyprus. Pretty much the next day or two, they arrive at Cyprus, and then that same evening is the drunken brawl with Cassio, and this seems to be the next day. So if you counted that up, even a generous count, you'd probably get no more than a week since the time that they were married. On the other hand, later on what we'll see is that Othello says that Desdemona has committed the deed with Cassio 100 times. Now, there is not enough time in 7 days for that to have happened. So there's a kind of double time scheme where on the one hand it's telescoped, it's compressed into a few days. On the other hand, weeks might have gone past. So there's this tension in the play between these two ideas. And I suppose what we see here is that longer time period. So Desdemona seems to suggest that Othello has been awake for quite a number of nights and he's not been sleeping very well. So she says, you know, I'll bind it hard with my handkerchief. I've never come across this as a solution to a headache, but I suppose Desdemona thinks it will work. She's going to bind it hard with the handkerchief and it will be well. And Othello says, your napkin, your handkerchief is too little to do that. And she drops the handkerchief. And this is one of the most significant moments in the play. We learn later on that this handkerchief is a love token that Othello has given to Desdemona. So if you've seen any films like A Knight's Tale or anything like that, you'll know that often the knight or the hero gives the girl a handkerchief as a symbol of his love, and she waves it while he's, you know, going off to war or doing whatever it is that men do in those films. So this is one of those love tokens, but it seems quite insignificant here. And then Othello and Desdemona leave, and Amelia moves forward very quickly to pick up the handkerchief, and she says, "I'm glad I found this napkin." This was her first remembrance from the moor, so this is the first thing that Othello has given to Desdemona. Notice that Amelia says the moor, which is what Iago calls Othello. So linking this in with our big idea, with our question, how does Shakespeare present the patriarchal society? We have the idea that Amelia just kind of falls in line with what Iago does, and she echoes his language here. And Amelia says, my wayward husband. So wayward means, someone who doesn't always stick to the rules, someone who can be quite poorly behaved, someone who's difficult to keep track of. So she says, my wayward husband hath 100 times wooed me to steal it. Now here's another reference to that kind of longer time period. Is it possible that since Monday or whenever the week started, that Iago has said 100 times to his wife, get me that handkerchief? It seems a little bit unlikely. So it must be the longer time period that we're working with here. So Amelia says, my husband hath 100 times wooed me to steal it. He's asked me to steal this handkerchief. But she so loves the token that she reserves it forevermore about her to kiss and talk to. So Desdemona keeps it all the time with her, and she kisses it and talks to it. So even when Othello's not there, this handkerchief kind of stands in for Othello. This handkerchief becomes the physical embodiment of Othello. So Desdemona kisses it, and it becomes the intellectual, emotional stand-in for Othello as well, because Desdemona talks to it. So I know that seems a little bit ridiculous, that Desdemona would do something quite so childish, but this is all part of building up the handkerchief as a really important symbol in the play. This handkerchief is going to become a symbol of loyalty to Othello initially when Desdemona has it. And then when Cassio has it, it's going to be a symbol of Desdemona's lack of loyalty, or supposed lack of loyalty, to Othello. So Amelia says, I'll have the work taken out. So she'll get the handkerchief copied to make a new handkerchief, because it's got a nice pattern of strawberries on it. And I'll give it to Iago. What he will do with it, heaven knows. So here, Amelia is removing herself from all responsibility. She doesn't know why Iago wants this handkerchief. She just knows that he wants it. Now, Amelia is remarkably uninterested here in what Iago's plan is. She doesn't seem to have any concern about what he could possibly be doing with this handkerchief. My mind runs wild as to what Iago's going to do with this. Amelia doesn't seem to care. And she says, I nothing but to please his fantasy. So she doesn't think of anything but pleasing, but making Iago happy and fulfilling his ideas. So here she does seem to be the ideal Renaissance wife, following what her husband has asked her to do, even though that's leading into a nefarious area. And I suppose what this also emphasizes is Amelia's innocence, that she doesn't understand Iago's plan, and that's going to be quite important when we get into Act 5. So Amelia goes to find Iago, and she kind of dances around the issue of the handkerchief. And it's quite clear here that this is an abusive relationship between Iago and Amelia. And she has finally found something that's going to make her husband happy. So she's going to try and make use of this to solidify their marriage, to get some kind of good treatment from her husband that she doesn't normally get. Now, unfortunately for Amelia, that doesn't happen, and Iago just says, good wench, give it to me. So he's quite dismissive, he's quite offensive towards her, and look at that imperative, give it to me. He's just commanding her what to do. And Amelia says, what will you do with it, that you have been so earnest to have me filch it? So what are you going to do, given that you've asked me to steal it from Desdemona? Iago snatches it out of her hand. So this is symbolic of their relationship, of the disgust that Iago feels towards his wife, how dismissive he is towards her, and this shows us how women were treated by their husbands often in this patriarchal society. And Iago says, what's that to you? Like, why has this got anything to do with you? And Amelia says, if it be not for some purpose of import, so if you're not taking this for an important purpose, for an important reason, give it to me again. Her lady, so Desdemona, she'll run mad when she shall lack it. So she'll be mad when she realises that she's lost this handkerchief. So Amelia does have some sympathy here for Desdemona, but at this point in the play, her overarching idea is that she wants to please her husband and she wants to have a good marriage with him. And so she sees this handkerchief as a symbol that's going to make this marriage better. Now, this is, I suppose, one situation where Iago twists good things to make them debased, to make them bad, because from being a love token, this handkerchief then becomes a point of disagreement between them. And this is where the kind of chaos around the handkerchief starts. So Emilia goes off and Iagos' plot develops. And he says, I will in Cassio's lodging lose this napkin and let him find it. So he's going to take the handkerchief and basically leave it lying in Cassio's room. He says, trifles light as air are to the jealous confirmations strong as proofs of holy writ. Now, this is a really interesting quotation. So a trifle is something unimportant. It's not a dessert. It's something unimportant. It's light. It doesn't matter. It's unimportant. But to jealous people, unimportant things can confirm just as much as Holy Writ, just as much as a Bible or as a religious text might. So even though this handkerchief seems really negligible, it's going to convince Othello about the affair. Now, there was a critic called Thomas Rymer who wrote about Othello in the 17th century. And I've put a quotation from him up on the screen, and he says there's been so much ado, so much stress, so much passion and repetition about Handkerchief. Why was this not called the tragedy of the handkerchief? So he's making fun of the play, and he's saying this is ridiculous. This handkerchief is absolutely ridiculous. Had it been Desdemona's garter, so a garter is a piece of female underwear. So had it been Desdemona's garter, the sagacious Moor, the wise Moor, might have smelt a rat. But the handkerchief is so remote a trifle, no booby on this side of Mauritania could make any consequence from it. So Thomas Rymer does not buy into this idea about the handkerchief. But what Rymer misses here is that this is exactly the point that Iago is making, that the handkerchief is so unimportant that actually there must be something else going on here. You know, if Othello is convinced by this object, then actually what it really shows is that it's Iago's lies have pushed him to the edge. It's pushed him so far to the edge that he'll believe anything that Iago tells him. So Iago says, this may do something. The Moor already changes with my poison. Dangerous conceits are in their nature's poisons, which at the first are scarce found to distaste. But with a little art upon the blood, burn like the mines of sulphur. So Iago's saying that he's already poisoned Othello's mind. And this idea of poison is quite a common motif across the play, a little bit like disease imagery or the plague imagery or animalistic imagery that we see elsewhere in the play. And poison is here verbal, but eventually Othello asks for real poison in the play. And I suppose in terms of the connotations, if you want to analyse the word poison, the symbol poison, you would think about something that there's no cure for. You know, there's nothing that can change what's going to happen now because Othello has been poisoned. So it's almost as if the end of the play is inevitable and Shakespeare is ramping up the tension at this point. And then this last line, burn like the mines of sulphur, is a reference to hell. And we talked in the previous video about how Iago is always associated with imagery of debasement, such as imagery of hell. So in terms of a little bit of independent learning, thinking about that big question we were asking about the patriarchy and how women are presented, I want you to consider this statement. Shakespeare presents Emilia as completely subservient and submissive to her husband Iago. To what extent do you agree? So create yourself a table, ideas to agree with this on the one hand, ideas to disagree with it on the other hand, and I've put an example up there for you. So thank you very much for listening, and I do promise that the next video will be the last one on Act 3, Scene 3.